Hello, my name is Kathy Anderson, and I'm the Gifted Education Program Consultant at the Kentucky Department of Education. Today, we are going to be covering some information for new Gifted Education coordinators. Today, we will be talking about the following topics. I'm going to give an overview of the responsibilities of the coordinator, regulations, the GT Coordinator Sample Handbook, the Gifted Data Standards, Infinite Campus for the Gifted Program, talk a little bit about funding, explain about missing records and data, and then also give you some supports and resources. First, we're going to review the responsibilities of the GT coordinator. According to Section 9 of the Gifted Regulation, a district receiving state gifted education funding must designate a gifted education coordinator. This coordinator is going to do several different things, as you can see from the slide. They are going to oversee the district gifted education operation. So that could mean that the GTC, or the Gifted and Talented Coordinator, is going to oversee GT staff. It could mean that they're going to ensure that services are provided to students. It could mean that they are communicating with parents and with other staff about the gifted education program. The next part says that they're going to serve as the liaison between the district and the state. So that could mean that they're going to be the point of contact between the Kentucky Department of Education, KDE, and the district. And they're going to ensure that the appropriate staff receive GT communications, ensure that the KDE school directory is updated. They're going to attend KDE GT trainings or meetings. And then the next part says that they're going to ensure internal compliance within the state statutes and administrative regulations. Well, there are many state statutes and administrative regulations, but for the Gifted Education Program, the regulation is 704 KR 3:285. And so it's very important that the Gifted Education Coordinator be very familiar with this regulation. And we're going to give a high level overview of the regulation to help you with that. It also says that the GT coordinator will administer and revise the gifted education program budget. So every 2 years, the General Assembly allocates funds to the gifted program. And so it's very important that the gifted coordinator know how to allocate those funds. There is a state matrix, and we'll look at that a little bit later, located on the state grants webpage that tells you how to allocate those funds and which codes can be allocated for those funds. The state grant webpage also tells you how much money your district will receive. Next, I'm going to give a high-level overview of the gifted regulation, but please ensure you review the regulations thoroughly. There will be training opportunities throughout the school year for new GT coordinators. During these trainings, I will go into more depth about the regulations. The gifted regulation, as I said earlier, is 704 KR 3:285. There is a link to this regulation on the GT Resources webpage. The first part of the regulation gives an introduction, so it covers the definition of gifted students and that districts must have a gifted program. It also states that gifted students are a category of exceptional children. There are 10 sections in the regulation, and we're going to go over these in a high-level review, each one of these sections. So as I said before, there's kind of an introductory part to the regulation. And the important ideas to this kind of introductory paragraph are that GT students are a category of exceptional children and that all districts must have a gifted program, grades primary through 12. It also talks about that these programs need to serve these 5 gifted categories. And it lists the categories of creativity, general intellectual ability, leadership, specific academic aptitude, and visual and performing arts. Specific academic aptitude and the visual and performing arts are broken down into subcategories, and you can see those listed there on the slide. Sections 1 and 2. So section 1 is a section of definitions, and these definitions, they cover many terms that are covered in the regulation. So if there's ever a term that you're unsure of, or if you wonder what it means, please turn to the section 1, which is the definitions, and look for a definition for that word. You'll see several definitions there listed on the slide, such as cluster group, collaborative teaching, GT identification and placement committee. So that particular definition tells you who needs to be on that placement committee. Number 19 in the definitions, which is high potential learner. This is another term that's used interchangeably with primary talent pool student. Also, the definition of underachieving is there. So there are many definitions that are covered in section 1. Section 2 is a very short section, and it talks about policies and procedures. And so in section 2, it talks about that districts need to have available for public inspection policies and procedures which are locally board approved and procedures that address each requirement in 704 KR 3:285. So if you're thinking about making sure that your policies and procedures are available for public inspection, a place that you might want to put your policies and procedures would be on your district webpage. Section 3 covers identification and diagnosis of gifted characteristics, behaviors, and talent, and determination of eligibility for services. Section 3 is one of the longer sections in the regulations, and it covers a lot of material. So I would suggest that you review this section very carefully because it covers much of the criteria for the identification of the 5 areas that students can be referred for identification in the gifted program. The first part of this section talks about that districts need to have policies and procedures which provide identification and diagnosis of strengths and gifted behaviors and talents. And it talks about how to do that. It talks about that there needs to be informal selection and diagnosis in the primary program. So the primary program is known as the primary talent pool, and this is for students who are in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade. And you'll notice there are more instructions or regulations around how to identify students for the primary program. And you'll notice that as you look down through section 3, it talks about that students need to be informally selected. So what we're trying to do with the primary talent pool is several different things. We're trying to cast a wide net to be as inclusive as we possibly can for a group of students that we will be able to look at for formal identification in grades in grade 4. But as we're doing this, we want to make sure that as we collect that data, you'll see in the regulation that it says that formal assessment should not be used to not include a student in the primary talent pool. You can use that data to help you determine services and the level of services for students, but it's really important that we try to be as inclusive as possible because we are informally selecting these students. Now, when we talk about formally selecting students, this begins in grades 4 through 12. That's when identification begins. You could begin to collect information and evidence for students in these other grades to help you identify students when you get to 4th grade, but that's where 4th grade, that's where identification that begins. So it's very important to notice that. You'll notice that formal identification is also covered in the definitions in section 1. But we just don't want to only identify students in grade 4 for formal identification. We want to remember that we want to continually be looking for students from grades 4 through 12. You'll notice that's also one of the words that is mentioned in the regulation there. And also that once we select or identify students for either primary talent pool or for the formal identification, that services need to be offered, need to be provided to these students. So services, it says primary through grade 12. And it also says multiple services. So that's important to note as well. Section 3 also has a section on equal access. And in this section of the regulation, it talks about the districts must provide a system for diagnostic screening and identification of strengths, gifted behaviors, and talents, which provide equal access for racial and ethnic minority children, disadvantaged children, and children with disabilities. So this could mean that as you were looking at assessments, as you are looking at the different processes, that you need to be thinking about how can we provide equal access for these underrepresented populations that are stated here in this subsection of the regulation. It's very important that we remember that if we have students who are children with disabilities or children with accommodations, that those accommodations be provided when they are being assessed. Also, for our disadvantaged children, it's important to, as we look at those assessments, to make sure that the assessments that those children would have an equal advantage to. Let's look at Section 3 some more, because as I said before, Section 3 is a long section. So on this particular section, it talks about that a school district must implement a procedure to obtain parent or guardian permission prior to the administration of an individual test that's given as a follow-up to a test routinely administered to all students, used in formal identification and prior to official identification and placement. So what does this mean? So this means that districts must have a procedure to obtain parent or guardian permission to an individual test. So for example, let's say that your district gives a test to screen all students for general intellectual ability. And after giving this test of general intellectual ability, perhaps you have several students who have high scores and you want to further assess them for formal identification. If you're going to give them an individual test, then you will need to get parent permission to do that. The next bullet point says that the district must have a procedure, must implement a procedure for obtaining parent or guardian input related to a student's interest, needs, and abilities to determine appropriate services. And you'll see that in the Gifted Coordinator Sample Handbook, there is a parent input form there if you want to use a form to obtain parent or guardian input. There would be different ways to obtain parent or guardian input. A form would be one way to go about obtaining that information. I've also known districts to use parent and family nights as times to meet with parents to talk about their students' interests and needs and abilities. But you do need to have a procedure, and that procedure has to be implemented to obtain that information for students. The next bullet says that parents or guardians of an identified student must be notified of their student services annually through the Gifted Student Services Plan. So there are different ways to go about notifying parents of their Gifted Student Service Plan or the services through the Gifted Student Services Plan. You can have a form of your own that you do that through. Several years ago in Infinite Campus, we worked with their staff to develop a gifted student services plan form, and that can be created through the student's record. There are directions on how to do that in the GT data standards. There are several advantages to using the Gifted Student Service Plan in Infinite Campus. One of those advantages is that you can see this form in the parent portal. So parents, once they log into Infinite Campus, they can see their child's Gifted Student Services Plan. So it's something that you wouldn't have to print out to put in the student's backpack or to mail home. So it saves you some time and cost there with paper and also with mailing. Something else that's really nice about the Gifted Student Service Plan in Infinite Campus is it creates a history of all the Gifted Student Service Plans that have been created for that child. So it creates a history there. Also, you can copy this Gifted Student Services Plan. So if the following year, let's say you've created a Gifted Student Services Plan or a GSSP, and the next year the services are going to remain the same, you can copy that and create it again for the following or the upcoming school year, I should say. As you can see, there are several different advantages to using this form in Infinite Campus. So as we were talking about Infinite Campus, I did want to bring to your attention one of the reports that you can generate in Infinite Campus. And this report is a quality assurance report. So it helps you to compare maybe your district report data to state report data. And it is a really good report to use. If you can't see this report, contact your CASIS or Kentucky Student Information Systems representative. They'll be able to give you permissions to see this report. The click path is noted there. Also, you'll see that there are two views or two different reports that you can run. You can run a detail report, which gives you student level data. It will list all the students in your district who have been selected K through 12 for the gifted program. It gives you information about that student. It tells you whether or not they're a male or female. It also tells you the categories that student has been identified for. You can also run a different report. This is called the aggregate report. This report gives you percentages. And by percentages, I mean it will tell you the percentages of how many male students you have in your gifted program or how many female students you have in your program. It gives you a percentage of the different ethnicities in your program. But we'll look at that in a little more detail here in a second. And so it helps you also to look at proportionality or disproportionality in your district. And we're also going to talk about some best practices to ensure equity in your program. Let's look at that. This report has 3 different pages. And you'll notice here on the first page that there's a lot of information that's given about this report. And it's put in table form. And you'll see that at the top of the table, it gives you the year. You can run this report for other years. So if you want to look at trend data, you can change the calendar at the top in Infinite Campus to a different year so you can see a different year's stats. And also you'll see that you're going to get information about your gifted and talented program as well as the total enrollment in your district, which is very nice. It's going to give you a student count and then a percent to either your GT program or a count and a percent to the total enrollment. You can also see that it breaks the students down into different groups. It breaks them down into gender, by race and ethnicity, by student by student accountability groups, and other student groups. And then it's really nice to just be able to see like how many, what is the percentage of African American students in your GT program, and then look at the total enrollment. What is the percentage of African American students in your total enrollment? And in this example, you can see there's less than 1% of African American students in this example of GT students in the program. And in the total enrollment, there is 1 point, looks like 23, little over 1% of African American students in this example. And as you look at the comparisons, you'd like for those percentages to somewhat mirror um, each other. So you wouldn't want those numbers to be really way far off. You'd want them to be proportionally about the same. And as you look at those numbers, if you're seeing that there's a large discrepancy between those percentages, it would be worth having a conversation maybe with your GT selection and placement committee, maybe about the procedures that are in place, policies and procedures that are in place for identification. You might want to talk about the assessments that you're using. You could also talk with your supervisors and other administrators in your district about the policies and procedures and the data that you've collected. This has some really good data to help um, guide those conversations so that you can talk about the equity in your gifted and talented program. Page 2 is a really interesting page as well. This page breaks down the data by the different categories and subcategories for your gifted program. And you'll see that at the top, you've got your gifted education category counts. It lists a total count at the left-hand side. And at the far right side, it also breaks out your primary talent pool. So if you're looking to see exactly how many formally identified students that you have in your system, then you would subtract that primary talent pool number from the unduplicated count, which is on the far left-hand side. So in this particular instance, our example, we've got about 251 students, and then we've got 7 primary talent pool students. And something that you want to think about too is like we were saying before with our primary talent pool, we want to cast a wide net. And you'll see in the definition of high potential learners, it talks about selecting a quartile or 25% of your students from your primary talent pool for your primary talent pool. And that just helps to ensure that you've got that wide base in order to select from for your formal identification. And it helps to make sure that, our younger ones have those supports and are engaged in the learning that they will need to grow, and that we're making sure that they have those services they need or that differentiation in the classroom that they need to grow and be engaged as learners. Going back to the form, you'll notice that this particular report again breaks the students down according to gender, race and ethnicity, and the other accountability groups according to the gifted categories. So, for example, in this district, there are 72 students who've been identified for creative and divergent thinking. And if you look at the females, there's about 52, looks like, females in creativity. If you break that down further, there's about, looks like, I think that says 0 African American students. But there are, looks like, 72 white students who've been selected for creative and divergent thinking. So it's just good to kind of look down through here and look at how the data is broken up for you on this page. The third and final page of this report breaks down the information according to um, the grades of the student. What grade are the students in that are in your gifted program? And so you'll notice I've got kind of a box around 4 through 12. And it's kind of interesting to note that as the years have gone on, for one reason or another, there's been a change in the number of students that have been identified over the years. So this is good data to look at as well. And then you can look and see what grades students are in for the different categories. Like, for example, in fourth grade, there are 2 students who were identified for general intellectual ability, for creativity, and then 5 students were identified for, 2 students were identified for general intellectual ability, and 0 students were identified for fourth grade. Um, so just kind of interesting information, data to look at to help you with those conversations with your supervisors and also with your GT selection and placement committee as you begin identifying students for your program and thinking about your policies and procedures, assessments, and other evaluations. Let's talk a little bit about research-based practices to increase equity in your GT program. So as you can see, the review of data would be very helpful to help you know who is in your program, what ethnicity they are, what gender they are, how many you have of those students, how many students you have in every grade. That's really important to review your data, and that QA, Gifted and Talented report, can help you do that. It's also really important to review your policies and procedures to ensure that we aren't creating any barriers for students as far as being able to refer students for the program. And also, as we look at our assessments and the way we go about giving those assessments. As I said before, if you've got any students that have accommodations, those accommodations must be given when you are assessing them. Then universal screening. Universal screening is very important to making sure that all students have access to identification. It's important to have assessments that allow you to do that and screening procedures that allow you to screen at least one grade level, all the grades in your school, so that you're not missing anybody and so that they all have that equal opportunity. Another research-based practice to increase equity is an early identification program, as we're identifying students early on in our kindergarten through grade 3. That's ensuring that we are finding those students who've got high potential and making sure that they've got those services and differentiation that they need in order to be successful. And then that also helps us as we um, go and formally identify them later in those grades because they've got that good background. They've got those services that they needed in their background to help them be successful. Another way to increase equity is to use local norms. So, local norms as opposed to national norms, that's when you are comparing scores within your building or within your district rather than comparing those scores of your students to groups of students in maybe a national group. And so in this manner, you're looking at the high flyers that are actually in your schools. You're still going to use for like general intellectual ability and for those subcategories that are in the specific academic aptitude categories, you will still be looking at the 96th percentile or the ninth stay-9 for those students. But you'll be looking at different cut scores for those students because you'll be comparing the students within your building to that ninth stay-9. Then also teacher training is very important. Teacher training is very helpful for helping us to identify students. It helps them to know what characteristics to look for. It helps them to know that there are 5 different categories and how to go about looking for the characteristics of those students from the 5 different categories. Also, teacher training is important as they provide services or differentiate instruction for teachers. And so these are different ways to increase equity in our programs. And just going back to talking about teacher training and equity. So, as teachers are looking for those characteristics, our students who come from our underrepresented populations may have slightly maybe some different behavior characteristics than maybe a typical child. And so it's good for them to know what those characteristics might be. So section 4 is Not a really long section, but it's kind of a medium length section, I guess you would say, and it discusses or outlines the procedures for determining eligibility for services. And so in this particular section, it talks about there needs to be data gathering, that a district must develop a system for searching the entire school population on a continuous basis. And so we've talked about having, a screening process for at least one, if not, many different grade levels for your gifted program to make sure that we're not missing any students. Also, it's important to either use local or national norms to identify students. We talked a little bit about local norms and a little bit about national norms. And then it's important that you have a GT identification and placement committee. And as I said before, that's defined in Section 1, Definition 17, about who those members should be that are on that committee. I think it's good to have a building level committee because those are the people who really, know those students and work with those students and can help you review the evidences that are gathered for those students. Also, there needs to be a petition and appeal for services. So if you've got, you need to have a procedure for parents or guardians to contact the district who feel like, their student might have been missed in being identified or diagnosed for the gifted program. The last part of Section 4 is really important. This is Section 4, subsection 2, and this talks about the exceptions and special considerations for eligibility. So when we're talking about the exceptions and special considerations for eligibility, we're talking about, you know, students who are maybe bright, but for one reason or another, maybe they didn't score at the Ninth Stay 9, or maybe they didn't have another piece of evidence that's required in Section 3 that lists all the different requirements for those 5 categories. And so this section says that school personnel shall or must take into consideration environmental, cultural, and disabling conditions which may mask a child's true abilities that lead to the exclusion of otherwise eligible students, such as a student who qualifies as an exceptional child as defined in KRS 157. 200, a disadvantaged or an underachieving child. So again, this is a section that really helps to include all students, helps us to look at all students and to take into consideration any disabling condition, such as an environmental condition, a cultural condition, a disabling condition that might be masking a child's gifts or talents. And that's why it's really important to have a gifted and talented committee that as they look at that evidence, that they think about those children that maybe have these disabling conditions. And it also, it points out that there are students um, who may qualify under some special um, considerations here. It says such as, so this doesn't mean this is a these are the only students we think about. But it does say, give some examples here. And it talks about students who have an IEP. So those students might have a disabling condition, but they may be really great art students, or they may, maybe have a physical disabling condition, but their mental capacity is high above average. Then we may have some disadvantaged children, as I said before, who may be either socially or economically disadvantaged, and that's something to think about as you're gathering that evidence and considering that evidence for those children. And also our underachieving children. So these are children who show that they have high potential, but for one reason or another, there's a discrepancy in what they are doing, in the classroom or on their assessments and what they're capable of doing. So please, as you are working with your staff, GT staff, and the other staff in your buildings, please help them to understand that we do want to be thinking about students that might have special considerations. And also, as we work with our GT selection and placements committees, we want to make sure that they understand the special considerations section in the regulation. Section 5 is called the program evaluation. And so this is an important section. It's very short, but it says that district policies and procedures shall ensure that a program evaluation process shall be conducted on an annual basis and shall address. So this is saying that a district has to have policies and procedures that ensure that a program evaluation is conducted every year, and then it needs to address these components. So overall student progress, so we're talking about gifted and talented students progress. How are they doing? And look, you want to look at all 5 of your areas there. How are they doing? And also, we want to address student and parent and faculty attitudes, all 3 of those stakeholders. We want to gather their information about the program. You can do that either through paper pencil, you could do it through a digital form, you could do it both ways. You could gather information at meetings that you have with parents or faculty, and then maybe document that. Um, community involvement. Community involvement could be, how is the community involved in your program? Do you have people that come in and work with your students, or maybe facilitate a seminar? Maybe there are mentors in your program. And then the other way around, that could be seen as, how are the students involved in the community? Do you have students that maybe are working with, a church to provide food at a food drive? Are they working with veterans out in the community? I mean, there's just a whole host of things that could be involved there. I know during COVID that was a little harder, but now that we have improved ability to be in contact with people, hopefully that will be something that you can talk about more uh, within your program. Then cost effectiveness, that could be, how are the funds used in your program? Um, are there more funds that need to be used? Might could be discussed. But looking at how that gifted allocation is used. The next one is incorporation of the gifted education into the regular school program. So that's looking at, how is gifted education used in the school program. And we'll talk a little bit about more about that in section 7. But that's important to think about. Are you modifying? Are you supplementing? Are you replacing? How is gifted education being incorporated into the school program? The next part is the overall quality of instruction and program personnel credentials. And so we're looking at, how are our certified personnel who are working with our students, what is their quality of instruction? Is it, when we are assessing and assessing those personnel, how is that instruction going? I think that you might get some feedback about that from your parents and students and faculty about how that's going. But you could also be looking at the program personnel credentials. Does that person have a GT endorsement? Does that person have an advanced placement endorsement? Does that person have an emergency endorsement? What kind of credentials does that person or persons have that are working in your program? And then the last bullet there is future program directions and modifications. I think that could mean that once you've gathered all of that information from your program evaluation, what are you going to do with that information? What are the steps going forward, directions and modifications that you might want to make to the G2 program based on all the data that you've gathered from this annual evaluation? Then the second larger bullet there, data collected in the annual program evaluation, it says it must be used in the school and district instructional planning process. So that could mean several different things. I have seen where in People's Kentucky School Board Association policies that it states in their policies and procedures that the data that's collected must be shared with the site-based decision-making councils and with the local school board. But it could also be, sharing that information with different school groups by meeting with them. It could be shared in professional learning communities or with district learning communities. Um, but I do think that as we see there, it says that that data must be used to help with that instructional planning process. And then the last bullet talks about that local district policies and procedures must ensure or shall ensure that the school personnel report to a parent or guardian the progress of his child related to the gifted and talented student services plan at least once each semester. So for most of us, that's talking about the progress report that goes home to parents or is either seen in the parent portal in Infinite Campus. So again, I just want to say that there is a progress report form that was created several years ago that's in Infinite Campus that can be used to notify parents of a student's progress as it relates to their gifted and talented services plan. And as you'll see there, it says at least once each semester. So that could be usually in the fall semester, or it could be the spring semester. So it's up to each district to decide, if they want to, if they're on like trimesters, if they're going to do that, 3 times a year or twice a year, that would be a district decision. But it does say at least once each semester. And so you can either use um, a form or a process that your district decides, or it could be, or you could use the form that's an Infinite Campus. That would be a district decision. Section 6 is about services. So this is saying that districts must provide services for students primary through grade 12. And it talks about that these services need to be differentiated to meet the needs of students, that they need to be commensurate with their interest and needs and abilities, and they need to facilitate the high attainment of goals that are established in that Kentucky statute 158-6451. So we're talking about services that meet a student's interests, needs, and abilities. It's important to survey or talk with, know what students' interests and needs and abilities are. For example, you might have a student who's been identified for general intellectual ability, and you may wonder, well, what is that student's passion? What is their interest? Well, it's hard to know unless maybe you do a survey of some kind or maybe have an interview with that student to find out what those interests are. Because, you might be able to provide some services for students, based on their interest. Like, for example, maybe they're interested in robotics, or maybe they're interested in coding, or maybe they're interested in music, and you've got some different types of, um, you know, opportunities coming available this school year that would also provide services for that student's interests. This section also talks about there need to be multiple service delivery options with no single service option existing alone. So that's could be saying there that if a student is identified for, math and also language arts, that they need to have services for um, both of those identifications. Actually, it's not saying may; it's saying you must. You must provide um, services for all of the categories that a child has been identified for. And when you're in Infinite Campus, you'll see that you have to select at least two services uh, for a student. And then the last part of this section talks about that services need to be provided during the regular school day, with the exception of academic competitions or extracurricular offerings. So if you've got like maybe Governor's Cup um, competition, uh, I don't want to say trainings, but or rehearsals, but you're training for an academic competition, maybe after school, or maybe you're having a play, or you're having, chess club or different clubs after school. Those can be a service delivery option. But if you're having but other types of services, like if you've got a student who has been identified for language arts, and that student needs, after you're looking at their needs or whatever, maybe they need to be accelerated to the next grade level, or maybe they need to have differentiated instruction in the regular classroom. Those have got to be provided during the regular school day. Any types of services that are similar to the ones I've given examples for. Section 6, there are many definitions, or there are many services that are listed in Section 6. And so if you're looking for what those services mean, you can go back and look in Section 1 of the regulation. You can also click on that link that says Infinite Campus, and that will take you to a page in Infinite Campus that describes how to use the data entry tool for gifted services, or the describes how to enter a record in Infinite Campus there, and it also lists the definitions for many of the services there. Section 7 is about curriculum. So we talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about services to students, when we were talking about the program evaluation. So in this particular section, it says that there has to be a comprehensive framework or course of study for children and youth who are diagnosed as possessing gifted characteristics and behaviors, and it needs to be based on a district or school's curricula. And it's required to meet the goals that are established in KRS 157-6451. Also, a school must differentiate, replace, supplement, or modify the curricula to facilitate high-level attainment of the learning goals established in KRS 157-6451. And to assist those students who are identified and diagnosed to develop their interests, needs, and abilities. So as you can see, it's very important that students who are identified as gifted students, or students who are identified for the primary talent pool, that they have a framework, that the curriculum be different in some way for those children. It's up to the district about how they go about doing that. They can either differentiate, they can replace it, they can supplement it, they can modify that curriculum. But it is something that must be accomplished for those students. Section 8 deals with personnel. And so with personnel, there's a lot of information here that's kind of covered. And so I'm not going to read all of this, but it does say that a local school must ensure that direct services are provided to identified students, and it needs to be provided by professionally qualified and certified personnel as required by the EPSB, which is the Educational Professional Standards Board. And if you're not sure if your personnel are qualified like they need to be in order to work with gifted students, then please reach out to EPSB, give them a call, because they'll be able to help you with that. That is their office of work. And it also talks about that how teachers need to be appropriately endorsed, when they need to be endorsed in gifted education. And then it also talks about other personnel who work with gifted students, that they need to be prepared through professional development to address the needs and interests and abilities of the gifted students. Section 9 deals with budgets and funding. And so this is saying that state funds, we talked about those state funds a little while ago, that they must be used specifically for direct services to students who are gifted and talented. And it talks about that these direct services need to be provided by professionally qualified and certified personnel as required by EPSB. And it gives the KAR there that's been recodified to 16 KAR 2:110. and that is the regulation that deals with the gifted education endorsement. Then it says that 75% of a district's gifted education allocation must be used to employ properly certified personnel to provide direct instructional services. Also in section 9, it talks about state funding contingencies. So it says in order to receive your state funding that you need to do these four things. So A, you have to employ properly certified personnel to administer and teach in the program. You need to submit annually a local district education year-end report. Also, you have to submit a summative evaluation of the program and student progress. And also, you have to comply with all the sections in this administrative regulation or with the administrative regulation. So let's talk a little bit about the gifted coordinator. This is the regulation that talks about how to be certified as a gifted coordinator. And so you'll see that that is 16 KAR 4:010. And it talks about that a gifted education coordinator shall qualify for this position based on the following. You must have a master's degree or a non-degree fifth-year program. You must also have a certificate endorsement for teacher of gifted education, and you must have 3 years of teaching experience. You can request a gifted education coordinator certification by completing uh, the TC-26 application if you meet the requirements above. If you're not sure if you meet those requirements, please again contact the Division of Education Certification and Preparation. There is a phone number and there is their email. But please reach out for them if you have any questions about certification. The last section is section 10. This is procedural safeguards. And so this is saying that a district has to have grievance procedure for parents and guardians and students to resolve a concern about services. So this can either be talent pool services or it can be formally identified student services in their GSSP. And it talks about what the procedures must address. So the procedure has to address how and whom the grievance is initiated, the process for determining the need to evaluate or reevaluate the student, the criteria for determining if placement needs revision, procedures for ensuring that appropriate services are provided to all identified students, and procedures for ensuring participation of those students, of those participants that are listed there in the in that bullet there. So those people would be the parent or guardian, the regular education teacher, the GT teacher or coordinator, administrator, and counselor in addressing the grievance. So that is all the sections for the regulation. All right, we're going to just quickly talk about the GT Coordinator Sample Handbook. So this is the GT Coordinator Sample Handbook. You'll notice it's got a long table of content, so it covers lots of different areas about gifted education. There are sample documents and forms that you can use or that you can change as you need. So as I said before, these are sample documents. There's a calendar of events that kind of gives you an overview of what you might want to be doing with the gifted program during the school year. It also gives, like I said before, lots of different types of GT forms, either for referrals for, a certain category or checklists of a certain category. There are also in the back assessment suggestions and screening suggestions that you might want to take a look at. This is the parent input form. This is a sample form that you might want to use or you might want to modify in order to capture information from parents about their children to help you as you provide services for students. Let's talk for a little bit about Infinite Campus. So in Infinite Campus, you're going to need some rights in order to see reports and also to see the GT participation tool, which is where the GT record is entered. As you can see, there are lots of different ad hocs under state reporting. These are ad hocs that were created by KDE staff and then pushed out to districts that you can use. Many of these you'll use at the end of the year in order to clean up any data that you've got. And I would also suggest that, that you look at these different lists and compare those lists to any district list you have to make sure that you're not missing any students, like your student G&T student list there. Also, you might want to ensure that whoever's going to be helping you with the Gifted Student Service Plan or the progress report, that those personnel that have those system admin rights to help you publish your forms to the parent portal. Those forms to the parent portal. So the data standards, these are really important to make sure you've got a copy of these, either saved digitally or you printed these out, because these standards go over how to do everything that you need to know about anything in Infinite Campus. And so it talks about and gives directions and screenshots for how to enter a GT record. It talks about what to do when you have a missing record or evidence. Again, it tells you how to create a GSSP and progress report in Infinite Campus and how to publish those forms to the parent portal. It also goes over some information that you need to know about, how to enter a student if they have been identified using special considerations or local norms or using the military compact. So please make sure that you look at those data standards and you familiarize yourself with those, and also pass that information on to any staff that work with your GT students, especially if they're helping to enter data for Infinite Campus. So I want to talk just briefly about missing records. Um, First of all, GT records do not automatically transfer with the student. So when you have a student that moves to a different district, um, that does not automatically transfer with the student. There are directions, as I said, in the GT data standards that outline that process, and your enrollment personnel need to be aware of that so that you're not missing any students, so that those GT students aren't missing any services. Um, what you could do is if you've got a form that you give to parents or guardians when they enroll their child in school, maybe you might want to have a question that says, has your child been in a GT program prior to being in our district? That might help you just make sure that you haven't missed that student, uh, importing that student's record. I would suggest that maybe you work with your cases contact to create maybe an ad hoc where they can pull maybe a list of transfer students that maybe you can cross-reference with your, gifted students, or with those questions or responses you get from your parents and guardians about, you know, um, new students in your district. But you do want to make sure that you're not missing any students. And something else that I want to bring up here is that kind of what I call the broken chain of events. And so sometimes in a district, you'll get a new student and you'll, import their records from the previous student. And for one reason or another, that student's GT record doesn't come over with that student. But that student is a GT student. And what may have happened is the previous district, for one reason or another, may not have imported the record from the student from where the child maybe came for before. Maybe the child has moved several different times. And so what happens then is that we have to work together to figure out, well, how to import that record. Um, I would rather you not manually enter a new record, because that causes more records to be in the system, and that causes our data to not to be correct. So please reach out to me if you get you have a student that for some reason you can't import their record from the previous district, and let's work together to figure that out. Um, so I receive a missing records report once a week. Unfortunately, I'm not able to send out emails once a week about those missing records, so I try to do that at least quarterly. I try to send out, um, emails to district coordinators letting them know that they are missing, student records. And when you get those emails, if there's, you're not sure where to reach out to about that student's missing record, please contact me either through email or through telephone call. I would say that email could be maybe the better option there. Please don't send me the child's name for privacy reasons, but please send me their SSID number, and I'll be glad to look that up and try to help you locate where that student transferred from. Um, Once you have imported that record, very important to reach out to the district before to get any kind of documentation or GSSPs. Any kind of documentation for that student to put into their GT file that you keep at the district. If you reach out to the prior district and they don't have any identification documentation, then your district needs to begin to collect that information. You don't need to necessarily reevaluate that student or reassess that student, but that student may come with some assessment um, diagnostics that you could use to help you document that that student is a gifted student. And that's not to say that when the student comes to you that they're not a gifted student, but they do need to have that documentation. As we can see from Section 3, there are specific criteria that must be um, gathered for students to be identified, and so we have to have that information documented and on record for that child. So again, if they don't come over with any information, then you as the district need to begin collecting that evidence for that child. If you need any help with that, please reach out to me. My contact information is going to be at the end of this presentation. Also, something to think about is when you get a new student, the GT Selection and Placement Committee needs to discuss, services and placement. You may have a student who is going from elementary to middle school or middle school to high school. And as you look at those services that are in Infinite Campus for that child, those may not be appropriate anymore. And so it's very important to have your placement committee um, look at the student, the evidences, and gather input from parents to provide services for that student. And then also sometimes on the report that I talked about earlier that I get once a week that I will try to reach out to districts quarterly about. Sometimes what's missing is the ninth stay nine on that report. And that may be because the student was an older student and for some reason in the system, it's not saying that that student was selected for special considerations or local norms. Although with local norms, you should still be clicking the ninth stay nine for those students. So if that's the case, let's work together to figure that out. And I'm always glad to work with you on anything. Uh, I'm here for you to support you and to help you with issues such as the ones we've talked about on this particular slide. Let's talk for a second about funding. So the formula to calculate the gifted and talented state funding allocation for this school year has been revised. During the 2022 legislative session, the GT appropriation was increased from 6.2 million to 10 million a year over the next 2 years. So for this school year and for school year 2023-2024, the monies have been increased. That's not to say that they will increase anymore or will stay at that, but it has been increased for the next 2 years. And so with this increase in funding, we at KDE decided to look at the funding formula and wanted to change it to make it more equitable. And so we have changed that formula. So you will see that your district maybe had an increase this year in gifted funds. And of course, that's due to the increase to $10 million. But also, we wanted you to know about the funding formula. So, regardless of the size of your district, every district got a base amount of $20,000. And then, in addition to that base amount, the formula allocates a per student rate based on the previous school year's total enrollment, not the gifted education student enrollment, but the total enrollment in the school. And then for 2022-2023 school year only, we had 4 districts that would have received slightly less funding based on their total enrollment, but we didn't want those students to, those districts to see less money this year. So for this year only, they will be receiving the amount that they've had in previous years, or from the previous year, I should say. And if you want to know how much that award was, please go to the state grants webpage. And the new fiscal year begins July 1. This is a screenshot of the non-competitive funding matrix, and you will see that there are many columns on there. And in one of the columns, though, you'll see gifted and talented education. And over on the very far, I guess one of the far corners there, four far columns there, you'll see the Munis codes. And so these are the codes that are allowable to use on the different programs that you see there. And if you see a yes in the cell for that code, then funds can be used for that. But if you see no, then the funds cannot be used for that particular item. So work with your finance officer, download a copy of this for your files and familiarize yourself with what can and cannot be used for the gifted funds in your district. Let's talk quickly about resources and support. So we've got several different resources for you as the gifted coordinator. Be looking this year for an email about gifted consultant office hours. I'm going to have a way for you to register for some time to meet with me to talk about any, resources that you need or any questions that you have. Also, across the great Commonwealth, we have regional GT cadres that usually meet quarterly. If you're wondering who to contact, please reach out to me and I'll send you that point of contact for you to reach out to. Also, we are moving many of our resources to a SharePoint site called the GT Coordinator SharePoint site, or GT Coordinator One Stop. And so this training video, as well as the slide and ELA credit registration, will be at that GT Coordinator SharePoint site. Also, something new to our office is called News You Can Use. These emails come out once a week and go to the GT coordinators in the district. And so hopefully you'll be seeing these come to you very soon. They cover lots of news in our office. My office, besides doing gifted and talented, also does preschool, early learning, special education, and extra school services for students. So that will be going out to multiple coordinators and multiple programs, but hopefully you'll be seeing that soon. Also, quarterly, the Office of Special Education and Early Learning will be coming out with a quarterly newsletter. This newsletter will have information about guidance documents that may be coming up, information about, different programs, opportunity dates, training dates that will be in that quarterly newsletter. Also, there'll be a GT beginning and end of year training. The GT beginning of the year training usually covers updates that will be coming out, like in the GT data standards, any information or updates about maybe state consolidated monitoring, those types of things that are new for coordinators to know that were different than the previous year. And then the end of year training, that will also be coming out usually around April the 1st or so, and we'll cover how to go about doing correction of records and completing reports for the end of the year. Some other resources that you might find helpful is the Gifted and Talented Resources webpage. It's on the KDE website. This covers regulations, data standards, brochures. Also, we have a really great advocacy group in our state. They're called CAGE, or the Kentucky Association for Gifted Education. We have a national advocacy group, um, and they are called the National Association for Gifted Children. They have publications that come out for teachers and for parents. They have lots of information on their website that you might find helpful. Another web page that's really great that has lots of good gifted education links and resources for students, parents, and teachers is the Hoagie's Gifted Education page. And also, I provided some information to our science and math academies, Gatton and Craft. So please visit these websites when you have a chance. This is my contact information. Again, I'm Kathy Anderson. I'm the GT Program Consultant. I've given you my direct line there as well as my email. I look forward to working with you. Please reach out to me if you ever have any questions. Thank you again for attending this training. If you would like ELA credit for attending this training, please either send me an email or go to the GT Coordinator SharePoint page and register for credit there. Again, thank you for attending this training, and I hope to talk with you soon.